Okay, this is a CSS Cascading Style Sheets recap, covering some of the stuff that's done at level 4 just to make sure you're up to speed. So, fundamentals of Cascading Style Sheets, the whole idea of this is that you have an external CSS file that holds what we call your CSS rules. The rules can be created using a variety of different selectors, and each rule can contain many different properties: font size, color, font family, things to do with the box model, all the things you can use to control the presentation, the look and feel of your website. So that style sheet gets attached to a HTML page, and the end result is hopefully a lovely looking web page. The obvious benefit of having the CSS in an external style sheet is it means that you can have multiple HTML files. So you can have 40,000 HTML files, all gaining their styling information from a central CSS file. So that gives you ease of maintenance. If you want to change the look and feel of the site, that can be in theory relatively easily done by changing the one file, because all the HTML documents make reference to it. So there's some essential terminology behind CSS, and we'll run through these very quickly. So effectively we have something called a rule, which we'll come to. Rules are applied using things called selectors. Selectors can take the form of HTML element selectors, classes, IDs, pseudo-classes, attribute selectors, contextual selectors. There's a whole range of different techniques. It's all about targeting the bit of the page that you want to style up. We then need to think about where we locate these styles. As you've seen, the ideal is to place them in an external file, but it is possible to place them in individual documents, and it's also possible to place them in line as well, so they're in line with a specific bit of HTML to style that specific bit of HTML. The location and the selector type impacts on the style hierarchy, so we need to also consider what's known as order of precedence and the specificity of the styles, indicating which style is more specific than another to apply it when conflicts occur. So, rules and selectors first of all. So here's a CSS rule. It consists of a selector, and then in curly braces you have a property followed by a value. You can have multiple properties, and they should be listed with a semicolon separating each one. Be careful that you put those semicolons in, and be careful that you close a rule declaration with the curly brackets, because if you don't, the CSS will break at that point and it won't apply any of the styles from that point onwards. So they are fairly unforgiving. So we've got a range of different CSS selectors, from HTML selectors, which are very general by nature, through class selectors, ID selectors, attribute selectors, and pseudo-classes. So let's have a look at some of these. So HTML selector, as the name implies, is based around a HTML element. So you can pick any HTML element that you like, and then you can build a rule around that. So in this example, I'm saying if you're a H1, within an HTML document, then your font family is going to be Arial. And if you haven't got Arial, then please default to whatever your default sans serif font family is. We can use commas to list multiple tags. You can do this with multiple selectors, but I'll show you it here in the HTML context. So in the second example below there, that's saying if you're a H1 or a H2 or a H3 or a H4, then you pick up that rule and you pick up that font family. So very broad, often used to apply rules on the body tag, because everything's inside the body, so it makes a good default to set fonts, background colours, foreground colours, and often to reset paddings and margins on the box model. Classes give us a little bit more flexibility. They require us to declare a class, which we do with a dot. So in our style sheet we use a dot, then any alpha character, no numbers. You can't begin a class with a number, and avoid white space and special characters. You can camel case if you like, but generally a good idea to keep lowercase, So here we've got a class that I've declared called main text, and it's setting the colour, the foreground colour, to using RGB to be hexadecimal colour code to be black. To apply that in the document, you can add a class attribute to any HTML element. So in this example, it's been added to a paragraph tag. So it's saying that this paragraph is of class main text, and it will therefore pick up the black foreground colour. Classes can be applied multiple times per document. ID selectors, very similar to classes in that we define them ourselves with a user defined in the CSS file, and this time we use a hash rather than a dot. So we hash and then some name that you make up. Again, starts with an alpha character, don't use white space. Good idea to try and use semantic meaningful names. So in this example I've created an ID selector called main content and using a box model padding of 5 to put 5 pixels of padding around each side. How that's applied is, as the name would imply, is you use the ID attribute of any element and you can apply that to the file, to that bit of content. So ID versus class selectors, what's the difference? Because apart from syntax, on the face of it, they look very, very similar. The main difference is that the ID should be unique. It should only be used once per document. So there should only be one element in that specific HTML document that has an ID of main content. Classes you can use as many times as you like within a given document. Let's have a look at div and span, two fairly generic HTML elements which really only make sense when you add some CSS into the mix. A div is short for logical division. It's what's known as a block element in that it flows down the page vertically. A span tag is what's known as an inline element in that it flows left-right across the page. So in this example, I've got a div of ID main content and I've got a span of class highlight. Notice how there's multiple classes being used there because it's class. I can use it as many times as I like. Let's just show you what that looks like in CodePen. There you go. See, there's the styling for highlight. It's picking up the blue background colour and the white foreground colour, and the ID of main content is being picked up for that div, applying the padding and the border around all 4 sides. Okay, so let's move on into some more kind of specialized selectors. So this is an attribute selector. So attribute selectors are based on the attribute of any HTML element. So here, and they use square brackets. So in this example, it's saying, are you an image tag? And are you an image tag that's got a alt attribute? And if you are, let's apply a border. So in the HTML below, you see there's 2 image tags there, 2 different 2 JPEGs, and one of them has got an alt of an internet cat, and the other one hasn't. So the styling will only be applied to the first of those 2 images because it has an alt present. You can select by attribute value as well. So in the example below, we've got an input tag for a HTML form element, and we're checking to see if it's of type text. This is quite a common use case because there's lots of different input tags for different form elements. So in this instance, it's saying if you are an input tag of type text, then you'll have a grey background colour. So look at a little CodePen for that. So there's the images. Oof, that's a bit of a scary cat. And you see that this one has got the image, the border around the outside because that has an alt value, whereas the other one doesn't. Pseudo-classes. So pseudo-classes are defined in the CSS by the use of a colon. The most famous of the pseudo-classes relates to the behaviour of the anchor tag for hyperlinks, and it allows us to style the different states that are created by the HTML for a hyperlink. So for example, a hyperlink can be in the link state, which is just default link sitting there. It can be being visited, so your browser will remember that you visited it already, and by default that tends to be kind of a pinky purple colour. You can have a hover state, so when you hover over a link we can change its styling, and then you can have an active state, which is when you've physically got your cursor pressed down on that link, it's currently viewed as active. There's a little code pen for these. So there's my hyperlink, and we've got different pseudo classes for link, visited, hover, and active. Notice use of text decoration none. That's a common feature used with anchor tag. It will remove the default underline that you get with a hyperlink. The fun one is hover. It's going to change colour when I hover over it, like so. Bit of a bad choice of green. Now often in that example that's a little bit too broad brush. All links are going to pick up that styling, so you'd probably want to be a little bit more specific in your ruling. So in this example, those stylings on the pseudo classes are only going to occur if you find yourself inside of a element of ID nav. So they're the famous pseudo classes related to hyperlinks, but there are others. There is focus, that refers to when you place the focus on a element, mainly associated with form elements. There is first child, which is the first child of a parent element, and then there is last child, which is the last child of a parent element. Let's illustrate those by demo. So there's an input tag of type text, and we've got a focus, so it will change colour when I click inside it. So I click, that gives the focus, it's changed the state. You see it's picked up the green colour. These links here are this menu. They've been styled as displaying lines so that they flow left right, and I wanted nice little these little borders to separate them, and that's been achieved by targeting the first child to say that the border left is none. Child selectors or direct descendant selectors use the greater than sign. So this is only applied, in this instance it would be only applied where we had a paragraph tag which was a direct descendant, the direct child of a section tag. I'll show you that again in code pen. So here we go, we've got a section and a paragraph as the direct descendant. So only some other text is going to get styled. These others have got divs that are in the way. That means they aren't direct descendants, so as such they don't get styled. Universal selector, useful one. You just use a star sign, and that will mean that that rule is applied as a wildcard. Often used for resets, so a lot of designers will want to remove margins and paddings on everything, so you can do that. Also, I think something that you'll probably see in the labs, will use it for box sizing in order to change the way that the box model is calculated. Where to locate styles, so generally you're going to be wanting to place them externally. We can do that two ways, via either a link or a @import statement. You might want styles on a document by document basis if they're very specific to that file. We can do that with a style tag, so they're known as document level or embedded styles. And then you can also create inline styles, which are very, very specific and also hard to maintain. And it's where you use the style attribute of any given HTML element, and you can style it directly. So inline elements, they're placed directly in the HTML element, and you can list a series of properties just as you would do in an external file. They are very, very specific. They have what's known as the highest order of precedence, so they will generally tend to overrule if they are in conflict with some other styles that might be coming from an external or a document level style. So they're a good way of making sure that that style is applied. You will find later on in the JavaScript world we can manipulate these at runtime, if you like, in the browser, so that they do have a usage there. But generally it's something that you would try and avoid unless you're very clear in your logic for using them. Document level styles are declared within the head of the HTML document within a style tag, and they will only be applied to that document. So you might have some specific rules that it's not worth your while placing in an external style sheet, though it's always debatable whether that's the case, because an external style sheet, whether you use all the rules in there or not should act as a library of style. An external style, so this is the kind of recommended way that you place a link tag inside of the header of your document and you reference your style sheet from inside of there, and you have a relative path to wherever your style sheet is held within your file structure. Where you can, so that's the most common way, but you can also use the style tag as if you're going to build a document level style, but instead you can use @import, which is CSS syntax, to go and load a style sheet from a given URL. Benefits of @import: you can use @import in a CSS file. It is CSS syntax, and that means you can load style sheets into style sheets. Another reason why we call them cascading style sheets, because a style sheet can inherit styles from another style sheet. So let's look at order of precedence and specificity. So what happens if you have rules that conflict? Generally try and avoid this, but it does happen from time to time, and the basic concept is the nearer you are to the actual content, it's the nearest style that will win in the case of any conflict. Let's give you an example. So here we see we've got a H1, it should be styled up as black. That's what our document level style is saying, but we have a inline style styling it as green, which overrules it. So it's nearer the content, it's more specific, therefore it has higher order of precedence. Now you can make rules more or less specific, so the longer that selector is the part of the rule, the more specific you are being, and the more specific you are, the more likely that rule it will be applied. Now there is underlying mathematics used to work these out. Basically an ID selector has the highest weighting, so ID selectors and class selectors, because they are user defined, are more specific than general HTML selectors. Now bear in mind that you can go a little bit overboard on this, so there's a great CSS guru called Chris Coyer, and he says just be as specific as it makes sense to be. So you don't need to go wildly over the top, you just want to make sure that that rule gets applied where and only where you would like it applied. So let's just have a look at the CSS background property. So a fun one, and some whole range of different settings that we can apply here. So we can set up background images, we can have them repeat either not or along the X and the Y axis. By default they will tile across the whole background. We can fix them so that text can scroll up and down on top, and we can control their position both horizontally and vertically and with XY values. We have a background size property. It says property of cover, which has got a range of settings: auto, cover, contain, values. It gives you some nice functionality in that what it allows you to do is it allows the image to cover the background image in its entirety, whatever your page size, the image will resize to fit that space. Another little CSS trick is the use of sprites. We can use pseudo-classes so that when we roll over, so here we've got a div of hover, a pseudo-class, so when we roll over this it changes the image, so it's using a sprite sheet. We've got in this PNG file there's two versions of that image, and we change the positioning here on the hover in order to make it look as if the image has changed. So all you're doing is just changing the visible bit of the image. It's a sprite sheet trick used in gaming. Okay, now CSS3 is the kind of latest and greatest version of CSS. It's given us a whole range of new selection techniques, new presentation techniques and animation techniques. Just quickly, before we dive into that, just give an honorary mention to CSS 2.1. that gave us some features like attribute selectors, but it also gave us features like @font face, which is like @import. It's a CSS syntax that allows you to customize, load in customized fonts There's a great service called Google Fonts you might want to investigate, where you can see the code used for loading custom fonts above and beyond the widely available fonts. So if you want to make your pages pop a little bit more with interesting fonts, you can use at font face. There's lots of online technology to do with fonts that Google Fonts will nicely abstract away from you. And if you're doing this yourself, you've got to get hold of all the GLIMP files, that's the individual characters to load in. They can, and there's a requirement to have a range of different font GLIMP types across different browsers. So I would strongly recommend that you do look at Google Fonts, where a lot of this is abstracted for you. So, sorry, just quickly. So you see in here we can pick a font, and once we pick a font, something like that one, we say that's great, we want that, add it down here, and if we click down here we can see that's the link to the style sheet that we use. If you look at the at import, that's the at import we place in our style sheet. If we look at that itself, if we go to that, you will see that there is the at font face loading in all the different file types required for that particular font to work. There you go, there's an example at font face. There are also iconic fonts where we can use icons like so. Most famous of those is Font Awesome. We'll see that used in the labs, that's good fun. And so CSS, getting on to CSS3 now, that's given us some new selection techniques. So we have disabled, enabled, checked, useful, particularly related to form elements. So in this case that is disabled, so it's appearing red. And we have env child, env type of, last child, etc. Allowing us to do things like create stripy tables, which is good fun. So there's some new selector techniques. We also have pseudo-elements. So pseudo-elements differ from pseudo-classes in that they have 2 colons at the beginning, and they refer to certain parts of an element. So for example, first letter or first line. First letter would target the first letter in an element, first line, the first line in a block of an element. So let's look at first letter here. We can, let's come out there, let's do that again quickly. Off we go. Right, so in this one we're able to style up the H there by targeting the first letter with a pseudo element with the 2 colons there to make it bigger than the rest of the font. First line, similar kind of idea. First line is made bigger using the pseudo element. Before and after, they're quite good fun. The common use case for those is if you want stylized quotes around some content, you can add some. There is a content property in CSS that allows us to put stylized big quotes around text. It's quite a common use case. And then other fun CSS techniques are border radius, box shadow, text shadow, gradients, opacity, ability to set RGBA, so alpha colour settings. Do take a look at those to add an additional bit of stylistic style to your pages. It's worth noting box sizing as well. I'm not going to go over the box model in this video, but the box model is important to be aware of, and the traditional box model is calculation of width. The CSS width property is calculated inside of padding and boarding. You'll find it's generally more useful that the width size, particularly if you're dealing with percentages, which is often the case on a mobile first type design. If you're designing in percentages, it's often better to have width calculated using padding and border. Then that means that it's slightly more intuitive in the way that you can design things, and we can set that behaviour of what's known as border box by using box sizing border box. So do be aware of that one. Finally, CSS position. So CSS position, the name may imply that this is the go-to property for laying out web pages. I would say it's quite the contrary. It's a little bit weird, a little bit counterintuitive if you don't really dig into what it's up to. So by default, all content in a web page has a CSS position of static. That means it assumes normal flow. So block elements flowing down the page, inline elements flow left, right. But you can change that to what's known as CSS absolute. Now when you do that, you can use CSS properties of top, bottom, left or right to place that content absolutely. Now we often work on pixel type values, but when you're doing it where they absolute to, they are absolute to the any parent element that is itself positioned either absolutely or relatively. That's where it gets complicated, because it does mean you have to concentrate on the parent element as well. Position relative will move content relatively to where it would normally be in the normal flow. So we can use that to kind of nudge content a little bit up or down if you feel the need to do that. Often we use position relative in association with position absolute, because you make the parent relative. That means the child, when it's positioned absolute, is positioned relatively to its parent. It's minority interest stuff, this, so you do not feel that you need to particularly be aware of this. Where position absolute is commonly used is because position absolute, because it takes content out of what's known as a normal flow, allows the position of content on top of the other content, and that can be stacked using something called z-index. The final one of interest is position fixed, and we can use that to fix content. So you can have things like fixed headers and fixed footers. It's a nice stylistic thing to do, but it can be a little bit complex because you don't know what screen sizes people have got, because they'll vary across device and the computer they're using to access this stuff. Okay, so yeah, that's me reiterating the position stuff. Okay, so that should give you a good overview of CSS, and doesn't cover the box model, so you would need to look at that as well. Thank you very much.